Glasses clinked in the dim restaurant, masking the hum of nervous conversation. Nomi stared at her tepid risotto, praying her blind date would stop talking about his mutual funds. She just wanted a normal, boring, safe life. Then the heavy oak doors splintered inward. Men in dark suits flooded the dining room. At their center walked a man she had spent 3 years trying to forget. He ignored the screaming patrons, fixing his dark eyes solely on her. "Get up, Nomi. You're marrying me instead." Alfonso chewed with his mouth slightly open. It wasn't a terrible flaw, just a mildly annoying one. He was a regional manager at a logistics firm, wore a tie that was 2 shades too bright for his pale complexion, and smelled faintly of drugstore aftershave. Nomi took a slow, deliberate sip of her Pinot Grigio. It tasted metallic cheap. She forced a smile anyway. This was what she wanted. This was the blueprint of a normal life. No burner phones, no midnight phone calls instructing her to wipe a hard drive. Just a Thursday evening at a mid-tier Italian restaurant with a man who thought a risky weekend involved buying generic brand toilet paper. "So I told my supervisor," Alfonso said, leaning over the candle in the center of the table, oblivious to the fact that the flame was dangerously close to his polyester blend sleeve. "If you want that kind of quarterly yield, you have to restructure the supply chain. You can't just cut corners on freight." "Fascinating," Noemi murmured. She wasn't bored exactly. She was relieved. Boredom was a luxury. For 3 years, she had meticulously scrubbed her identity, leaving behind the jagged edges of a world built on extortion and hollow-point bullets. She had traded her high-end tailored skirts for clearance rack slacks and taken a job managing payroll for a regional dental supply company in Chicago. She was 32, utterly unremarkable and perfectly safe. Until she wasn't. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the scraping of cutlery, the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers, the low murmur of 30 different conversations died instantly. It didn't fade. It was cut off as sharply as a severed artery. Nomi didn't turn around right away. Her spine went rigid. The hair on her arms stood up. She knew that kind of silence. It was the sound of apex predators entering a room full of grazing prey. What in the world? Alfonso frowned, looking past her shoulder. He dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the ceramic plate. Noemi slowly turned her head. The heavy frosted glass doors at the front of the restaurant hung crookedly on their hinges. 2 large men in charcoal suits stood on either side of the entrance, their hands resting casually over their stomachs, right where their suit jackets bulged. 3 more men fanned out into the dining room. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. Their posture alone screamed violence. The maître d' was backed against the host stand, his face the color of old chalk. Then he walked in, Lachlan Barnes. He hadn't changed. He still wore his wealth and power like a second skin, a bespoke navy suit that draped perfectly over a boxer's frame. Jet-black hair swept back, but perpetually untamed at the edges. Sharp, aristocratic features that always looked carved out of something unforgiving like marble or ice. He didn't scan the room. He didn't look at the cowering waiters or the patrons shrinking into their leather booths. His dark, heavy gaze snapped straight to the small corner table in the back, straight to Nomi. Panic, cold and sharp, drove a spike into her lungs. She couldn't breathe. 3 years of running, 3 years of looking over her shoulder, and it ended on a Thursday over lukewarm risotto. Lachlan moved through the tables. He walked with a fluid, terrifying grace. The men flanked him a silent vanguard. "Excuse me," Alfonso said, his voice trembling slightly, but attempting a tone of righteous civilian indignation. He stood up, pushing his chair back. "You can't just barge in here. People are trying to eat." Lachlan didn't even look at him. He stopped at their table. He was close enough now that Nomi could smell him cedar-cold night air, and the faint, metallic tang of gun oil, Nomi Lachlan said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that bypassed her ears and rattled directly in her ribcage. "Lachlan," she replied. Her voice was remarkably steady, considering her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to hide them. Alfonso looked back and forth between them, his confusion morphing into a nervous, defensive anger. "Noemi, do you know this guy? Because I'm about to call the manager. Or the police." Lachlan finally spared Alfonso a glance. It was a brief, dissecting look. He took in the cheap tie, the sweat forming on Alfonso's upper lip, the slight tremble in his knees. Lachlan's lip curled in an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. "You dragged yourself out of my bed, crossed 3 state lines, and spent 3 years living in a roach-infested studio apartment so you could sit across from this?" Lachlan asked, his voice dripping with venom. Alfonso puffed up his chest. "Hey, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but..." One of Lachlan's men stepped forward, placing a massive, scarred hand on Alfonso's shoulder. The pressure must have been immense, because Alfonso instantly crumpled back into his chair, the breath leaving him in a sharp wheeze. Not another word Alfonso Noemi said sharply. She didn't look at her date. She kept her eyes locked on Lachlan. "Leave him alone, Lachlan. He's just a civilian. He doesn't know anything." "I don't care what he knows," Lachlan said softly. He leaned down, placing both hands on the table, boxing her in. His face was inches from hers. The darkness in his eyes was absolute. "I only care that you're sitting here with him. Playing house, playing normal." "I am normal," she snapped back, a flash of old defiance piercing through her terror. "I left. You knew I left. You let me go." "I gave you a head start," Lachlan corrected her, his tone conversational, almost gentle. "I had things to handle, my father's mess, the territory. I let you breathe Nomi. I let you have your little vacation. But time is up." He reached out his long fingers, wrapping around her wrist. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was unyielding. "Get up," he commanded. "No." She pulled back, but he didn't budge. "You can't just drag me out of here. I have a life here. I have a job," Lachlan smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Your job thinks you moved to Seattle for a family emergency. Your landlord has already received a check for breaking the lease. Your belongings are currently being packed by my people. You have no life here, Nomi. You only have me." Alfonso let out a whimpering sound. Lachlan ignored him. He tightened his grip on Nomi's wrist and pulled her to her feet. She stumbled slightly, knocking her wine glass over. The pale liquid spilled across the white tablecloth like a spreading stain. "Get up, Nomi," Lachlan said again, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, meant only for her. "You're marrying me instead." The night air was a shock to the system. It was raining a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the Chicago pavements and reflected the harsh neon lights of the storefronts. Lachlan kept his hand firmly on the small of Nomi's back, guiding her out of the restaurant and onto the sidewalk. She didn't fight him. Fighting a Barnes in public was a quick way to get collateral damage, and she wouldn't have Alfonso or a terrified busboy paying for her resistance. A black Maybach idled at the curb, its engine a low, menacing purr. 2 SUVs were parked at jagged angles in the street, blocking traffic. Horns blared in the distance, but no one dared approach the convoy. The men in suits formed a protective ring. A driver in a flat cap scrambled to open the rear door of the Maybach. Lachlan practically shoved her inside. She scrambled across the plush leather seats, pressing her back against the far door, trying to put as much distance between them as possible. Lachlan slid in beside her. The door slammed shut, cutting off the sounds of the street. Inside, it was silent, smelling of expensive leather and Lachlan's cedar cologne. The car began to move smoothly, effortlessly, pulling away from the curb. Nomi watched the restaurant shrink in the rearview mirror. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw Alfonso standing on the sidewalk, holding his jacket over his head, looking utterly bewildered. "You ruined my date," Nomi said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic she felt. It was a defense mechanism she had perfected years ago, when she worked balancing the ledgers for Lachlan's late father, dealing with millions in blood money, while trying to pretend she was just a glorified accountant. Lachlan scoffed. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned back against the headrest, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He looked tired. There were deep shadows beneath his eyes, and the harsh lines of his face seemed more pronounced than she remembered. "I saved you from a lifetime of talking about freight logistics and clipping coupons," Lachlan muttered. "It was my choice," she shot back. "Why are you here, Lachlan? Really? You don't track down your father's runaway accountant after 3 years just because you got jealous of a logistics manager." Lachlan opened his eyes and turned his head to look at her. The streetlight strobed across his face, illuminating the hard, uncompromising set of his jaw. "Don't flatter yourself, Nomi. I didn't come here out of jealousy." "Then why?" "Because the Commission has demanded a consolidation," he said, his tone turning brisk professional. "The Mafia boss replaced the angry former lover. With my father dead, the old guard thinks the family is weak. They think I'm too young, too erratic. The Moretti family has been encroaching on our ports in New York. The Commission's solution is a marriage, an alliance." Nomi frowned, her mind racing, slipping easily back into the cold calculus of the underworld she thought she had abandoned. "They want you to marry Isabella Moretti." "Exactly. And you refused." "Isabella is a viper. If I marry her, I'll be dead from poison in my scotch within 6 months, and the Morettis will take the ports without firing a single shot," Lachlan said smoothly. "I told the Commission I was already engaged, to a woman outside the families, someone who poses no political threat, but who solidifies my stability. A woman who knows my business, knows my books, and won't flinch when the guns go off." Nomi stared at him, horror dawning. "You used me as an excuse." "I used you as a solution," he corrected. "The wedding is Sunday. Once we're married, the Commission backs off. The Morettis lose their leverage, and I keep my territory." "No." The word burst out of her, sharp and desperate. "Absolutely not. I am not marrying you. I am not going back to that life. I got out, Lachlan. I kept my mouth shut. I took nothing. I disappeared." "We had a deal." Lachlan shifted closer. The immense, suffocating weight of his presence pressed against her. He didn't touch her, but he didn't need to. He trapped her with his gaze. "We never had a deal, Nomi. You ran away while I was burying my father. You left me when the city was burning." There was a raw, jagged edge to his voice, now betraying the cold facade. "You think you were hiding? I knew where you were 3 days after you landed in Chicago. I let you stay because the war in New York was too bloody. You were safer here playing your little game of pretend." Her breath hitched. "You've been watching me." Every day, he admitted, unapologetic. "I knew what coffee you ordered. I knew you hated your boss. I knew you sat by the window in your apartment when it rained. I kept you safe." His eyes darkened, fixing on hers with terrifying intensity. "And then you started dating. You let that pathetic, soft little man touch your hand. You smiled at him. You said you weren't jealous." Lachlan let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "I lied. I watched you across that table tonight, and I wanted to break his neck just for breathing your air." Noemi shrank back against the door. He was insane. He was exactly the dangerous, possessive monster she had fled. "I won't do it," she whispered. "I won't say I do. I'll tell the priest no. I'll tell the Commission the truth. Lachlan reached out, finally touching her. He ran a single knuckle down the side of her cheek. His skin was warm. The touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence simmering in his eyes. "You won't," he said softly. "Because if you don't marry me, I will have no reason to protect Alfonso, or the sweet old lady who lives next door to you, or the girls you eat lunch with at your office. If you aren't my wife, Noemi, you are a loose end. And you know what the family does to loose ends." A cold dread pooled in her stomach. He was trapping her, building a cage out of her own empathy, knowing she wouldn't let innocent people die for her freedom. She swallowed hard, staring into the pitch-black depths of his eyes. "You're a monster." Lachlan's thumb brushed her lower lip. "I know, Mia Cara. But starting Sunday, I'll be your monster." The flight to New York was a silent, suffocating affair. They flew on a private jet, the cabin bathed in low amber light. Lachlan worked on a laptop across the aisle, surrounded by encrypted phones and folders, completely ignoring her. He was back in his element, a king managing his chessboard. Nomi stared out the window at the black expanse of the sky, her mind a frantic loop of panic and calculation. She looked for an exit, a loophole, a weakness in his plan. But she knew Lachlan. He didn't make moves without locking down every variable. And right now, she was just a variable he had finally decided to lock down. By the time the armored SUV pulled through the towering iron gates of the Barnes estate in Long Island, it was nearly 3 in the morning. The estate hadn't changed. It sat on 20 acres of prime coastline, a massive brooding structure of grey stone and slate. It was beautiful in a brutal, imposing way. High walls, motion sensors tucked into the manicured hedges, men with earpieces patrolling the perimeter. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress. The heavy wooden front doors swung open as they climbed the stone steps. The interior smelled exactly as she remembered, beeswax, old mahogany, and a faint trace of expensive cigar smoke. "Take her bags to the east wing," Lachlan instructed, a quiet, broad-shouldered man standing in the foyer. He turned to Nomi. "You know the way to the guest suite." Nomi crossed her arms over her chest. The damp chill of Chicago had seeped into her bones, and she was exhausted. "Why the guest suite? If I'm supposed to be the devoted fiancé, shouldn't I be in your room?" Lachlan unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling them up his forearms. He didn't look at her. "I have calls to make. Europe is waking up, and I have to assure our overseas partners that the transition is stable. You need sleep. Don't act like you care about my well-being." She snapped her fatigue, making her reckless. "You just kidnapped me, Lachlan." He stopped rolling his sleeves and finally looked at her. The exhaustion in his face mirrored her own, but there was a dangerous spark in his eyes. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Nomi held her ground, refusing to step back, even as he towered over her. "I didn't kidnap you," he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur that echoed off the high ceiling. "I brought you home. This isn't my home. It was my prison, and now it's my cage again." Lachlan's jaw tightened. He reached out, gripping her upper arms. His touch burned through the thin fabric of her blouse. "You were dying out there, Nomi. I saw it. You were grey. You were fading away in that miserable little life, pretending you didn't miss the adrenaline, pretending you didn't miss this." He gestured vaguely to the opulent, dangerous world around them. "I missed sleeping through the night without wondering if a car bomb was going to take out my block," she fired back, her voice shaking with unshed tears of frustration. "I wanted peace. There is no peace for people like us." Lachlan yelled the sudden volume, making her flinch. He caught himself taking a ragged breath, dialing the fury back down. He pulled her slightly closer. His forehead almost rested against hers. "You were born into this life, Nomi. Your father died in it. You have the same blood I do. You can wear all the cheap cardigans you want and date all the boring men in the Midwest. It doesn't wash it off. She stared up at him, hating him for being right, hating him for knowing the dark, twisted part of her that had felt a sick thrill when he walked into that restaurant. The quiet life had been safe, but it had felt like suffocating in slow motion. "I hate you," she whispered. Lachlan's eyes softened just a fraction. It was a terrifying vulnerability, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I know. But you'll survive it." He let go of her arms, the loss of his heat, leaving her suddenly shivering. "The wedding is on Sunday," he said, his tone flat and businesslike once more. "Tomorrow a team will be here to fit your dress and arrange the details. Do whatever they ask. Don't fight my security. Don't try to run. There is nowhere you can go that I won't find you by dinner time." He turned and walked toward the grand staircase, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. "Lachlan," she called out, before he reached the first landing. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Why me?" she asked, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a hollow exhaustion. "You could have bought off any woman to play this part. Someone who would smile and nod and take your money. Why drag me back into this hell?" Lachlan stood perfectly still for a long moment. The silence in the massive house was deafening. Because he said quietly, his back still to her, "If I have to stand at an altar and swear my life to a woman, I refuse to lie." He walked up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows of the second floor. Nomi stood alone in the foyer, the weight of his words pressing down on her lungs. She looked around the gilded, heavily guarded cage. 2 days. In 2 days she would be chained to a man who ruled an empire of blood, a man who possessed her with a terrifying absolute certainty. She dragged her hands down her face, let out a shuddering breath, and began the long walk toward the east wing. Morning arrived, not with sunlight, but with a highly coordinated invasion. 4 women in severe grey dresses swept into the guest suite, carrying garment bags, steamer trunks, and boxes of shoes. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Nomi barely had time to sit up in the massive, unfamiliar bed before they were stripping off her borrowed sleepwear and pulling her into the center of the room. Cold hands measured her waist, her bust the slope of her shoulders. Pins pricked her skin. None of the women spoke to her. They communicated in sharp, clipped whispers, adjusting panels of heavy ivory silk and pinning delicate lace against her collarbone. Nomi stared at her reflection in the gilded floor-length mirror. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was pale, stripped of the faint tan she had acquired walking to the train station in Chicago. The silk dress was exquisite, severe, and incredibly expensive. It fit her like a second skin, yet it felt heavier than a suit of armor. "You look exactly like a target." Carmine Rossi stood, leaning against the doorframe. He was a man carved from old-school brutality, his face mapped with deep creases and a jagged scar that cut through his left eyebrow. As the family's oldest capo, he had served Lachlan's father, and now served Lachlan, though clearly with reservations. Nomi didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the mirror, watching his reflection. "I didn't pick the dress, Carmine. Take it up with the warden." Carmine pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly into the room. The seamstresses scattered immediately, melting into the corners to pack their tools. They knew better than to breathe the same air as a capo when he wanted privacy. "You shouldn't be here," Noemi Carmine rasped. He stopped a few feet behind her. "You were a good numbers girl. You kept your head down, you washed the money, you didn't ask questions. But you ain't a Barnes. You don't have the stomach for what's coming. I'm painfully aware of that." Nomi turned to face him, the heavy train of the dress dragging across the Persian rug. "I didn't ask for a reunion. Your boss dragged me out of a restaurant in the Midwest against my will. Then you tell him no. Carmine's dark eyes narrowed. You tell him you won't stand at that altar. Lachlan is young. He's thinking with his pride, not his head. The commission wants him to marry Isabella Moretti to stop a war. He brings you up there. Instead, he's insulting New York. He's putting a bullet in his own chest. And yours. Fear, cold and metallic, tasted sharp on her tongue. She knew Carmine was right. The Mafia didn't respect love, and they certainly didn't respect defiance. They respected leverage and blood. He threatened innocent people if I refused, Noemi said quietly. Carmine scoffed. He's bluffing. Lachlan ain't his father. He doesn't kill civilians for sport. Call his bluff accountant. Get on a plane and disappear before Sunday, or I swear to God, you won't live to see Monday. Are you threatening my fiancé? Carmine Lachlan's voice cut through the room like a physical blow. He stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. But there was nothing casual about the posture of the two-armed guards standing behind him in the hall. Carmine stiffened, slowly turning to face his boss. Just giving the bride my best wishes. Lachlan, reminding her of the weight of the name she's taking. Lachlan walked into the room. He didn't look angry. That was what made him terrifying. His father used to yell, "Throw things, break jaws," when he was crossed. Lachlan went perfectly, dangerously still. She knows the weight, Lachlan said smoothly. He stopped right in front of the older man. What you need to remember, Carmine, is your place. You advise. I decide. I have decided she is my wife. If you speak to her again without my permission, I will have your tongue mailed to your wife. Silence stretched thick and suffocating. Carmine's jaw clenched, but he finally lowered his chin in a stiff, tight nod. Understood, boss. He brushed past Lachlan and walked out, his heavy boots fading down the corridor. Lachlan watched the doorway for a long moment before turning his attention to Noemi. His gaze dropped, taking in the ivory silk, the fitted bodice, the lace creeping up her neck. The dangerous coldness in his eyes shifted, melting into something darker, something possessive and hungry. Leave us. He commanded the seamstresses without looking at them. Doors clicked shut. They were alone. Noemi crossed her arms, shivering, despite the heavy fabric. He's right, you know. You're starting a war just to prove a point to the commission. And you're using me as a human shield. Lachlan stepped closer. He reached out his fingers lightly, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. I'm not using you as a shield. I'm placing you behind the thickest wall I can build. I don't want to be behind your wall. She jerked her head away from his touch. I want my life back. I want my crappy apartment and my boring job and my safety. Safety is an illusion, Lachlan murmured, stepping into her space until the tips of his shoes touched the hem of her dress. You thought you were safe in Chicago. You were just lucky I kept the wolves busy on the East Coast. The Morettis have been probing my weaknesses for months. If they found out where my father's former accountant was hiding an accountant with the entire financial architecture of my family in her head, do you think they would have let you eat risotto in peace? Noemi swallowed hard. The truth of it stung. She had memorized accounts, shell corporations, bribe rosters. She was a walking hard drive. If I'm such a liability, why not just kill me? She asked, her voice dropping to a bitter whisper. Lachlan's hand shot out, wrapping around the back of her neck. His grip was firm, anchoring her in place. He pulled her forward until her chest brushed against his suit jacket. Because he said his breath, ghosting over her lips, I am a selfish, ruthless bastard. And I would rather burn New York to the ground than let anyone else have you. He didn't kiss her. He simply held her there, letting the absolute certainty of his claim sink into her bones before turning and walking out of the room. Saturday night stretched long and dark. Rain lashed against the tall arched windows of the estate, a rhythmic, violent drumming that made sleep impossible. Nomi threw off the heavy duvet and swung her legs out of bed. The digital clock on the nightstand glared red 2:14 a.m. In less than 14 hours she would be walking down the aisle in the estate's private chapel, surrounded by 300 mobsters, politicians, and killers. She needed a drink, or a way out, preferably both. Padding barefoot down the long, carpeted hallways, she kept to the shadows. The house was quiet, but it wasn't asleep. She could see the glow of security monitors from the guard station at the end of the hall, and the faint scent of stale coffee hung in the air. She bypassed the main staircase and slipped down a narrow servants' hall that led to the library. She knew Lachlan kept a bottle of 20-year-old Macallan in the Globe bar there. She just wanted one glass to quiet the frantic buzzing in her skull. Pushing the heavy oak door open, she froze. A single desk lamp was on. Lachlan sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his jacket off his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. Spread across the desk were dozens of photographs, blueprints, and what looked like shipping manifests. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat near his right hand. He didn't look up, but he spoke. "You're supposed to be resting. Tomorrow is a long day." Nomi hesitated, her hand still on the brass doorknob. She thought about turning around, but the desperate need for a drink outweighed her desire to avoid him. She walked in, letting the door click shut behind her. "I couldn't sleep," she said, walking straight to the Globe bar in the corner. She opened it, retrieved a heavy crystal tumbler, and poured herself 2 fingers of scotch. She didn't bother with ice. The burn of the alcohol going down her throat was grounding. Lachlan watched her take the sip. He leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were bruised and purple. "Is Isabella Moretti beautiful?" Noemi asked suddenly. The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Lachlan frowned. "What?" Carmine said. "You're insulting New York by not marrying her. I'm just curious. Is she beautiful? Would she have made a good Mafia wife?" Noemi leaned against the bookshelf, clutching her glass. "Isabella is a sociopath," Lachlan stated flatly. "She shot her own cousin over a dispute about a gambling ring in Queens. She's beautiful in the way a loaded gun is beautiful. And she would have made a perfect Mafia wife. She would have smiled for the cameras, hosted the dinners, and plotted my assassination before our first anniversary." Nomi let out a dry, humorless laugh. "And I'm the safer bet. I hate everything you stand for, Lachlan. I hate the violence. I hate the fear. I hate the fact that your father ordered hits while I was in the next room, balancing his ledgers." Lachlan sat forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He didn't defend his father. He never did. "I know you do. That's exactly why you're the safest bet I have." She frowned, confused. "Because I won't kill you. Because you are the only completely honest thing in my world," Lachlan said, his voice dropping, carrying across the quiet room. "Everyone else looks at me and sees money or a threat or a stepping stone. You look at me and you see exactly what I am. You don't flatter me. You don't lie to me. You ran from me because you knew exactly how dangerous I was." He stood up and walked slowly around the desk. Nomi gripped her glass tighter. She told herself to step back, but her feet felt glued to the floor. Lachlan stopped inches away. He reached out and gently took the glass from her rigid fingers, setting it on a nearby table. "I spent 3 years sitting in rooms filled with liars and killers, Nomi. And the only thing that kept me sane was knowing that somewhere in Chicago you were balancing a clean ledger, drinking cheap wine, and being utterly perfectly real. "You shouldn't have brought me back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't survive this world, Lachlan. I'm not made of whatever cold steel you are. You are stronger than you think," he murmured. He reached out his hands, sliding around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The heat of his body radiated through her thin cotton pajamas. Nomi gasped, her hands coming up to rest flat against his chest. She could feel his heart beating steady strong, completely unbothered by the chaos surrounding them. "I won't let them touch you," Lachlan promised his face, lowering until his lips were a fraction of an inch from hers. "Isabella the Commission Carmine. Let them try. I will drown this city in blood before I let a single scratch land on you." She closed her eyes, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. She was terrified of the violence in his promise, but God help her, a dark, twisted part of her was comforted by it. She had spent 3 years feeling entirely alone in the world. Now she was the center of a monster's universe. Lachlan kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate bruising and heavy with 3 years of repressed obsession. He tasted like scotch and impending ruin. Nomi let out a soft, broken sound and kissed him back, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as if he were the only solid thing left on earth. She hated the cage, but she was foolishly, fatally falling for the jailer. Sunlight bleached the stained glass of the estate's private chapel, casting jagged, colored scars across the cold stone floor. Nomi stood in the vestibule, the heavy ivory silk dragging at her shoulders. Her bouquet of white orchids trembled slightly in her grip. 2 guards flanked the heavy oak doors. They weren't looking at her. Their eyes were locked on the driveway, hands resting near their waistbands, fingers drumming against the holsters hidden beneath their jackets. This wasn't a wedding. It was a hostage exchange masked in Tool and Latin prayers. Music swelled from the organ inside a low, vibrating hum that rattled the floorboards under her heels. The guards pushed the doors open. 300 faces turned to watch her. There were no crying aunts or smiling cousins. The pews were packed with men who commanded unions-controlled shipping lanes and ordered executions before their morning espresso. They wore custom Italian suits that failed to hide the bulk of their shoulder holsters. Their wives sat beside them, draped in diamonds bought with extortion money, their expressions perfectly chillingly blank. Nomi forced her legs to move, heel to toe. Breathe in. Breathe out. Lachlan waited at the altar. He wore a black tuxedo that made him look like a dark, immovable pillar of marble. He didn't smile, but his eyes tracked her every step, burning with that same terrifying, absolute certainty from the night before. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the physical weight of the room's judgment pressing against her ribs. She recognized faces from the ledgers she used to audit. There was Dominic Moretti in the 3rd row, Isabella's older brother. He was a brute of a man with a thick neck and a permanent sneer openly glaring at Lachlan. Across the aisle sat the heads of the Chicago and Philadelphia outfits, observing the political suicide Lachlan was committing in real time. She finally reached the altar. Lachlan held out his hand. She placed hers in his. His skin was warm, his grip unforgiving. He pulled her slightly closer, anchoring her against the crushing hostility of the staring crowd. The priest began the mass in rapid, monotonous Latin. Noemi tuned out the words, focusing instead on the rhythm of Lachlan's breathing. He stood perfectly relaxed, entirely unbothered by the fact that half the room wanted him dead. "Do you, Noemi Morales, take this man?" The English translation snapped her back to reality. She looked up at the priest, a frail man who was sweating profusely under his stiff collar. She then looked at Lachlan. "I do," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She surprised herself. "Do you, Lachlan Barnes, take this woman?" "I do," Lachlan replied instantly. He didn't look at the priest. He only looked at her. He slid a heavy cold platinum band onto her finger. It felt like a handcuff. A very expensive permanent handcuff. The priest pronounced them husband and wife, rushing through the final blessing, as if he expected a shootout to interrupt the amen. Lachlan leaned down. His lips brushed hers, a brief, firm seal of the contract. "It's done," he murmured against her mouth. "You're mine now. Legally. Bound." He turned them to face the congregation. The silence was deafening. No one clapped. No one cheered. Then Dominic Moretti stood up. The fabric of his suit strained against his massive shoulders. He began to clap. Slow, mocking, heavy claps that echoed like gunfire in the vaulted ceiling. A few of his lieutenants joined in a sinister chorus of applause. Lachlan didn't flinch. He simply placed a hand on the small of Nomi's back and guided her down the aisle, walking straight past Dominic without affording him a single glance. "Keep your eyes forward," Lachlan whispered, as they passed the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The hard part is just beginning. Waiters circulated the grand ballroom, carrying silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A jazz quartet played a lively tune in the corner, trying valiantly to cut through the oppressive tension. The reception felt less like a celebration and more like a summit of warring nations waiting for the first shot to be fired. Nomi stood beside Lachlan, near the head table, her face frozen in a polite, unyielding mask. Her feet ached in her designer heels, but she refused to shift her weight. Showing discomfort was showing weakness, and in this room, weakness was chum in the water. Men lined up to pay their respects. They shook Lachlan's hand, kissed Nomi's cheek, and murmured hollow congratulations. She caught the scent of cigars, expensive cologne, and the distinct coppery undertone of violence on almost every man who approached. "You're doing perfectly," Lachlan said quietly, wrapping an arm around her waist as the boss of the Detroit family finally moved away. "I feel like a piece of meat at a butcher's convention," she replied, keeping her smile fixed for the cameras flashing near the entrance. "They are looking for cracks in the armor. Don't give them any." The crowd parted suddenly, like water yielding to a heavy ship. Dominic Moretti approached. He didn't have his lieutenants with him, which was a statement in itself. He stopped 2 feet from them, completely ignoring Nomi, locking eyes with Lachlan. "Barnes," Dominic said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly scrape. "My sister sends her regrets. She couldn't stomach the cheap champagne." "Isabella has always lacked taste," Lachlan replied smoothly. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden drop in temperature around them was palpable. "But she is always welcome at my table, assuming she learns how to behave at one." Dominic's jaw tightened. "You made a mistake today, Lachlan. A very public, very stupid mistake. The commission isn't happy." "The commission doesn't sleep in my bed," Lachlan said, finally pulling Nomi slightly forward. "My wife does." "Dominic, you remember Nomi, don't you? She used to handle the accounts for the waterfront properties. She knows exactly how much your family has been skimming off the cargo manifests." Nomi's heart hammered against her ribs. Lachlan was weaponizing her. He was showing them that she wasn't just a civilian bride. She was a vault of their darkest secrets. He was daring Dominic to make a move. Dominic finally looked at her. His eyes were flat dead, like 2 pieces of slate. "I remember the accountant. I thought she ran away because she couldn't handle the sight of a little collateral damage. I ran away because I was bored, Dominic." Nomi lied smoothly, tapping into a well of cold audacity she didn't know she possessed. "Your ledgers were sloppy. It offended my professional sensibilities." Lachlan let out a low, dark chuckle. Dominic didn't laugh. He stared at Nomi for a long, calculating second, then nodded slowly. Enjoy the wedding cake, Barnes. I hear it spoils quickly." Dominic turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of dark suits. Nomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking again. She reached for a champagne flute from a passing waiter's tray to give herself something to hold, something to ground her. The waiter was young, maybe early 20s, with a sharp jawline and nervous, darting eyes. He wore the standard white catering jacket, but the cuffs were slightly frayed at the edges. He offered the tray to Lachlan. "Sir," the waiter murmured, his gaze dropping straight to the marble floor. Lachlan reached for a glass. Nomi's mind trained for years to spot anomalies in endless columns of data snagged on a detail. It was the waiter's left hand. He was gripping the edge of the silver tray so tightly his knuckles were stark white. But that wasn't what set off the alarm bells in her head. It was the faint, jagged tattoo peeking out from beneath his frayed cuff. A black serpent wrapping around a rusted dagger. She had seen that tattoo before. 3 years ago, on a scanned security file for a low-level hitman contracted by the Morettis. Time seemed to downshift into slow motion. Lachlan's fingers curled around the delicate stem of the champagne flute. The waiter's eyes flicked upward just for a fraction of a second, filled with a frantic, desperate anticipation. "Lachlan, wait," Nomi said. She didn't shout. Shouting would cause a panic. She simply reached out and clamped her hand firmly over Lachlan's wrist. Lachlan froze. He looked at her, his dark brows furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Nomi didn't look at the glass. She looked directly into the waiter's face. The young man's skin drained of color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He took a half-step back, the tray, trembling violently in his hands. "I don't think you want that one," Noemi said, quietly, her voice entirely steady. "I think he brought you the wrong vintage." Lachlan's eyes darted from Nomi to the waiter. The Mafia boss processed the situation with terrifying speed. He didn't drop the glass. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply smiled, a cold, lethal baring of teeth. "Is that right?" Lachlan asked the waiter softly. "Did you bring me the wrong vintage?" The waiter bolted. He dropped the heavy silver tray. It hit the marble floor with a deafening crash, champagne flutes shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The liquid hissed furiously against the stone. Screams erupted from the nearby tables. Men shouted. Hands plunged into jackets. Lachlan didn't even flinch. He snapped his fingers. 2 of his guards materialized from the crowd like wraiths diving after the fleeing waiter. They tackled him before he reached the heavy brass swinging doors of the kitchen, pinning him to the floor in a mess of spilled drinks and crushed flower petals. The jazz music abruptly stopped. The ballroom dissolved into a chaotic murmur of voices and shifting bodies. Lachlan stood perfectly still amidst the wreckage. He looked down at the puddle of champagne seeping into the grout of the marble floor. Small acidic bubbles were eating away at a dropped linen napkin, turning the white fabric a sickly chemical yellow. Poison. Lachlan slowly turned his head to look at Nomi. The mask of the untouchable boss was completely gone. In its place was a raw, primal shock. "You saw it," he stated. It wasn't a question. "The tattoo on his wrist," Nomi whispered, her knees suddenly feeling very weak. "Moretti contract muscle. I saw it on an invoice file your father had me audit." Lachlan stared at her. The silence between them felt heavier than the panic filling the room. He reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the toxic puddle. "Carmine!" Lachlan barked over his shoulder. The old capo was instantly at his side, his scarred face grim and entirely focused. "Clear the room. Lock down the perimeter. Take that rat to the basement and don't let him die until he tells you exactly who handed him the glass. Done." Carmine said, his dark eyes flicking to Nomi with a new strange expression. It looked suspiciously like respect. Lachlan pulled Nomi toward the private elevators at the back of the ballroom. His grip was tight, almost painful, but she didn't complain. They stepped into the wood-paneled car, and the heavy doors slid shut, cutting off the noise and the staring eyes of the ruined reception. Lachlan hit the button for the penthouse suite. The elevator jerked upward. He didn't say a word. He backed her against the mirrored wall of the elevator and trapped her there, his hands planted flat on the glass on either side of her head. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving against hers. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. "I guess I did," she replied, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs. Why, the question hung in the small enclosed space. It was the only question that mattered. Why didn't she let the monster drink the poison? Why didn't she take her freedom when it was handed to her on a silver tray? Nomi looked up into his dark, chaotic eyes. She thought about the boring apartment in Chicago. She thought about the tepid risotto and the safe, empty life she had built. Then she looked at the man who had burned it all down, just to keep her. "Because," Nomi said, reaching up to gently touch the hard, unforgiving line of his jaw, "I told you, I hate sloppy bookkeeping, and I refuse to be a widow on my wedding day." Lachlan closed his eyes, a violent shudder running through his massive frame. He dropped his forehead against hers, inhaling the scent of her skin as if it were the only oxygen left in the burning world. The war had officially started, and Nomi finally admitted to herself with terrifying clarity that she was ready to fight it by his side. Steel doors slid shut behind them with a definitive metallic thud. The penthouse suite was a vast expanse of dark wood minimalist leather furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling, glittering grid of New York City. Lachlan didn't turn on the main lights. He walked straight to a low credenza, poured 2 glasses of neat whiskey, and handed one to Nomi. His hands were finally steady. Hers were not. Nomi took the glass, her fingers brushing against his. The chill of the crystal contrasted sharply with the heat radiating from his skin. She took a long, burning swallow. The amber liquid scorched its way down her throat, grounding her frantic nervous system. She turned to look out the window. Down below, the estate was swarming with armed men. Spotlights cut through the darkness, sweeping the manicured lawns. The sanctuary had transformed into a war camp. "He expected me to die on that altar," Lachlan said quietly. He dropped his suit jacket onto a nearby armchair and unbuttoned his collar. When I didn't, he tried to end it before the cake was cut. Dominic is impatient. It's always been his greatest flaw. Impatience nearly worked, Nomi pointed out, tracing the rim of her glass. He got a poisoned drink within inches of your mouth, in a room filled with your own security. That's not just reckless. That's a message. He wanted everyone in that ballroom to know he could reach you. He won't get a second chance. Lachlan pulled a burner phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the keypad. "I'm calling Carmine. We hit Dominic's primary shipping warehouses tonight. We burn the cargo, sink the boats, and send a hit squad to his estate in the Hamptons. We drown him." "No." The word left her mouth before she could think better of it. Lachlan stopped, his thumb resting on the illuminated screen. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The silence in the room stretched taut and dangerous. Nobody told Lachlan Barnes no. "No," he repeated, his tone dangerously soft. "Bullets are loud, Lachlan." Nomi set her glass down on the glass coffee table. She didn't back down. The adrenaline was still humming in her veins, sharpening her mind into a lethal, analytical blade. If you shoot up his warehouses, you start a street war. The commission gets involved. The feds get involved. Innocent people catch stray rounds. You said you didn't want a war. You said you wanted stability. Dominic just tried to murder me in front of 300 witnesses. Lachlan countered, his jaw tight. Stability left the building an hour ago. Then we bankrupt him. Noemi stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Dominic thinks like a thug. You need to think like a king. You don't need to kill his soldiers. You just need to make sure he can't pay them. Lachlan slowly lowered the phone. A flicker of genuine curiosity cut through his simmering rage. Explain. Noemi walked over to his massive mahogany desk and opened his laptop. She tapped her fingers against the edge of the keyboard, waiting for his password. Lachlan walked up behind her, leaning over her shoulder to type it in. He stayed close, his chest brushing her back, watching the screen as she pulled up a secure, encrypted spreadsheet. 3 years ago, your father had me audit the joint ventures we held with the Morettis on the docks. Noemi said, her fingers flying across the keys. Rows of numbers shell companies and offshore routing codes filled the screen. Dominic is greedy. He didn't just skim from your family. He skimmed from his own capos. He funneled millions into 3 primary holding companies in the Cayman Islands. He uses that shadow fund to pay his private hitmen. Like the kid downstairs. I know about the offshore accounts, Lachlan murmured, his breath warm against her neck. They're ironclad, untraceable. Nothing is untraceable if you know exactly where the money entered the system. Noemi corrected softly, a cynical smile touching her lips. He used a real estate front in Queens to wash the initial deposits. I memorized the routing numbers because the ledger entries were so ridiculously sloppy. It insulted my professional pride. She hit a final keystroke. A web of financial data illuminated the dark room. If we anonymously forward these routing numbers to the SEC and the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Division, those accounts will be frozen by Monday morning. Noemi explained, turning her head slightly to look at him. Dominic will lose 80% of his liquid capital in a single second. The federal government will lock him out of his own vault. His men won't get their envelopes on Friday. And a Mafia boss who can't pay his soldiers is a boss without an army. Lachlan finished the realization dawning in his eyes. The tension melted out of his shoulders, replaced by a profound, terrifying awe. He looked at the screen, then down at the woman sitting at his desk. You want to destroy Dominic Moretti with an Excel spreadsheet, Lachlan stated, a low, dark chuckle rumbling deep in his chest. I want to dismantle him, Noemi corrected, her voice deadpan. And I want to do it without ruining my wedding shoes in a shootout. Lachlan reached out his large hands, resting gently on her shoulders. He leaned down, pressing a firm, lingering kiss to the crown of her head. It was an act of complete surrender. Do it, mea cara. Bleed him dry. 72 hours later, the storm broke. It wasn't a storm of gunfire or shattered glass. It was a silent, devastating landslide of red ink. On Monday morning, federal agents raided 3 real estate offices in Queens. By Tuesday afternoon, Dominic Moretti's offshore accounts were frozen, pending a massive international money laundering investigation. By Wednesday, his top lieutenants were quietly reaching out to Carmine Rossi, asking if the Barnes family was accepting new contracts. The Moretti empire didn't explode. It simply starved to death. Noemi sat on the terrace of the master suite, wrapped in a thick cashmere shawl against the biting autumn wind. The sky was the color of bruised iron, but the estate below felt profoundly calm. The heavy guard presence had scaled back. The war had ended before a single bullet was fired. The French doors opened behind her. Lachlan stepped out onto the terrace. He wore a simple black sweater and dark jeans, looking less like a ruthless mob boss and more like a weary man who had just finished a long shift. He carried 2 mugs of black coffee, handing one to her before taking a seat in the wrought iron chair beside hers. Dominic requested a sit-down, Lachlan said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't look at her. He looked out over the ocean, where grey waves battered the rocky shoreline. Nomi paused, holding her mug with both hands to absorb the heat. Are you going to grant it? I already did. It happened an hour ago, in a diner off the interstate. Lachlan's voice was devoid of triumph. It was purely transactional. He looked like a ghost. His sister Isabella has already fled to Italy, taking whatever untraceable cash she could carry. Dominic has nothing left. His capos have abandoned him. His political connections won't return his calls because he's a federal liability. What did he want? He wanted a loan, Lachlan said, shaking his head with a humorless scoff. He offered to sign over the New York ports in exchange for enough cash to flee to South America before the feds issue a warrant. Nomi turned to face him, searching his stoic profile. What did you tell him? Lachlan finally looked at her. The darkness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, unwavering clarity. I told him the ports were already mine. I told him he had 24 hours to leave the country before I handed the rest of his ledgers over to the district attorney. He'll be on a cargo ship to Brazil by midnight. He's finished. A profound sense of relief washed over Nomi, loosening a knot in her chest she felt she had carried for 3 years. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a long, shaky breath. So that's it. We won, you won, Lachlan corrected softly. He reached across the small table between them, wrapping his hand around hers. His thumb brushed over the heavy platinum wedding band on her finger. You saved my life on Sunday, and you secured my empire on Monday. The Commission is terrified of you. Carmine thinks you're some kind of financial witch. He told me this morning that I should watch my back, or you might end up running the entire syndicate by Christmas. Nomi let out a genuine laugh. It felt strange, foreign, but entirely real. Tell Carmine his job is safe. I have no interest in ruling the underworld. I just want a decent cup of coffee, and a night where I don't have to check the perimeter alarms. Lachlan smiled, a rare, breathtaking break in his hardened facade. He stood up, gently pulling her to her feet. The coffee mugs were left forgotten on the table. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. The cashmere of her shawl bunched between them, but she could still feel the heavy, steady thud of his heart. I can give you that, Lachlan whispered, resting his chin on the top of her head. No more running. No more looking over your shoulder. You built the wall, Nomi. Now we get to live behind it. Nomi closed her eyes, resting her cheek against his shoulder. She thought about Alfonso, and the mid-tier Italian restaurant, and the crushing, suffocating safety of a normal life. She had wanted it so badly, but standing here, held by a man who had burned down a city just to keep her by his side, she realized she didn't want normal. She wanted him, the monster, the king, her husband. Okay. Noemi murmured into the soft wool of his sweater. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on tight. But you're doing the taxes this year. Lachlan let out a loud, echoing laugh that carried out over the crashing waves. He kissed the top of her head, his grip tightening, anchoring her permanently to his side. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a gritty, dangerous reality built on blood money and ruthless ambition. But as the cold wind whipped around them, Nomi knew one thing for absolute certain. She was exactly where she belonged. Did Nomi make a mistake by running, or is her new life about to become a nightmare she can't wake up from? The tension between her and Lachlan is just boiling over, and Sunday's wedding will change everything. If you want to see how Nomi survives the altar and the deadly mafia politics surrounding her like this video, share it with your friends who love dark romance, and hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, so you don't miss part 4, where the real danger begins.